Hello friends, welcome to lesson 5, principal types of stratification systems 2, estate and gender. Introduction. Estates were categories in feudal systems, especially in Europe during the Middle Ages. They were less rigid than caste and allowed some mobility. In estate system, men are assigned to their strata according to their birth, military strength and land holdings. Unlike caste, estates were created politically by man-made laws rather than religious rules. Each estate had its own code of appropriate behavior. Along with economic class and race, society is stratified by gender, with women often holding a lower social position than men. In the labor force, women are often relegated to lower status jobs, lower wages and fewer promotions and raises than their male counterparts. Sexism is discrimination against a person on the basis of their sex and tends to result in disadvantages for women who do not embrace their traditional gender role as mother and household overseer. Women's participation in the labor force also varies depending on the marital status and social class. Objectives. After completion of this lesson, you will be able to understand estate system and its characteristics. You will be able to understand about gender as form of social stratification. Let us begin our discussion with estate system. The term estates represents a type of stratification that existed in Europe during the Middle Ages. Estate system has a long history. The system emerged in the ancient Roman Empire and existed in Europe until very recent times. The estate system consisted of three main divisions: the nobility, the clergy and the commoners or the ordinary people. In England and France, for example, these three divisions were found. In some parts of Europe, for example Sweden, almost up to 1866, there were four estate divisions: nobles, clergy, citizens and peasants. Estate systems are characterized by control of land and were common in Europe and Asia during the Middle Ages and into 1800s. In these systems, two major estates existed: the landed gentry or nobility and the peasantry or serfs. The landed nobility owned huge areas of land on which serfs toiled. The serfs had more freedom than slaves had, but typically lived in poverty and were subject to arbitrary control by the nobility. Estate systems thrived in Europe until the French Revolution in 1789, which violently overturned the existing order and inspired people in other nations with its cries for freedom and equality. Over a period of time, European estate systems slowly gave way to class systems of stratification. After the American colonies won their independence from Britain, the South had at least one characteristic of an estate system: the control of large plots of land by a relatively few wealthy individuals and their families, but it obviously used slaves rather than serfs to work on the land. Much of Asia, especially China and Japan, also had estate systems. For centuries, China's large population lived as peasants in abject conditions and frequently engaged in peasant uprisings. These uprisings started in 1850s after the Chinese government raised taxes and charged peasants higher rents for the land on which they worked. After many more decades of political and economic strife, communists took control of China in 1949. Let us try to discuss about nobility. The members of the nobility had great inherited wealth and did little or no discernible work. They occupied themselves in leisure pursuits such as hunting or riding. Others cultivated interest in cultural pursuits such as art and music to ensure that their inherited wealth passed smoothly from one generation to next without being dispersed to members of the extended family. The nobility of the Middle Ages practiced the law of primogeniture. The word primogeniture comes from Latin and means firstborn. The nobility's law of primogeniture stipulated that only a firstborn son could inherit his father's wealth. Members of this stratum developed an ideology to justify their privileged positions, the divine right of kings, which posited that the authority of the king comes directly from the god. The king delegated authority to nobles because the king and the nobles were God's representatives. They had to be obeyed. The eldest son was guaranteed a healthy income upon the death of his father, but other sons had to find their own means of income. Few, if any, were tainted for work. So many became members of the Roman Catholic clergy, a body of religious officials. Another estate was clergy. The clergy was very powerful in European society in the Middle Ages, and membership offered long-term job security and a comfortable living. The higher up the ladder a priest went, the more power he had over the masses. The third estate was that of the commoners. This third tier of the estate system consisted of masses of people known as the commoners. They spent their lives engaged in hard physical labor with virtually no chance of moving up in the society. Let us now try to discuss about the characteristics of estate system. Legal basis of estates. Estates were legally defined. Each estate had a status of its own. More precisely, in a legal sense, the status was associated with rights and duties, privileges and obligations. As it has been said, to know a person's real position, it was first of all necessary to know the law by which he lived. In comparison with the first two estates, the clergy and nobility, the third estate consisting of the serfs or commoners suffered from many legal disabilities. For example, the serfs had the inability to appeal to the king for justice. They had no rights over their chattels or properties and holdings. They had the liability of paying the fines of 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 and 𝗘𝘅, that is, a fine paid to a lord for the marriage of a daughter and a fine paid to the lord on the death of a tenant respectively. Even different penalties were imposed on them for similar offences. Another characteristic is estates representing division of labour. The estates represented a broad division of labour. They had some definite functions. According to the law of the day, the nobility were to fight and defend all, the clergy were to pray, and the commoners were to pay or provide food for all. Another important characteristic was estates as political groups. The feudal estates were political groups, and it was an assembly of estates which possessed political power. From this point of view, the serfs did not constitute an estate until the 12th century AD. The decline of education feudalism after 12th century is associated with the rise of a third estate. The third estate behaved for a long period within the feudal system as a distinctive group before they overthrew it. Thus, the three estates, clergy, nobility and the commoners, functioned like three political groups. As far as participation in government was concerned, the clergy used to stand by the nobility. In France, the political position was more rigid. This system of three estates remained until 1789, that is till the outbreak of the revolution. In the French parliament called States General, these estates used to sit separately and not together. That differentiation within the estates prevailed for a long time. The political movement of the French Revolution brought about some radical changes in France. Friends, now let us discuss about gender. The concept of social stratification envisages two fundamental categories that help in defining social stratification, that is, hierarchy and difference. Gender stratification refers to the social ranking where men typically inhabit higher statuses than women. Often the terms gender inequality and gender stratification are used interchangeably. Gender stratification refers to men and women's unequal access to power, prestige and property on the basis of their sex. Through the process of socialization, individuals encompass gender into their personalities or gender identities and gender roles. In the context of patriarchal Indian society, men are given more power and resources as compared to women. Gender becomes an important dimension of social stratification. In matrilineal society, an individual belongs to one's mother's lineage and the children or offspring would inherit immovable or movable property and titles or surnames from their maternal lineage. For example, Garo and Khasi tribes in Meghalaya, Muslim tribes of Kalpeni in Lakshadweep and the Nayars of Kerala are matrilineal societies, although the Nayars have gradually transformed themselves into a patrilineal society over a period of time. There are a variety of approaches to the study of gender stratification. Most of the research in this area focuses on differences between circumstances of life of men and women, though the third gender also exists. Scholarly debates focus on which dimensions of inequalities are most relevant and the level at which inequalities are generated and maintained, that is, individual, couple, family, group or societal level. Researchers have been challenged to explore gender, race and class inequalities from an intersectional perspective rather than treating gender as independent of race and class. Women, for the very large part, are considered to be naturally inferior. The phenomenon of women being marginal and the weaker sex was taken so literally that a women's movement was needed to challenge the assumption. That is, to question inequality of gender and ask why women are unequally placed. Studies on stratification have for the most part assumed that the position of women can be derived from the position of her husband, father, brother, or whosoever happens to be the male head of the household. That the head of the household would be a male went unquestioned. Actually, it is not such a taken for granted matter. Recent studies have found many women-headed households. Credit organizations have found it more productive to lend out money to women rather than to men. Success stories of women, not just big entrepreneurs, but village women like fisherwomen, agriculturalists, weavers, and various self-help groups have increasingly come to be known. The mistaken assumptions of the inequalities being naturally derived from biological facts and of men being natural and universal head of households have led studies of stratification to ignore gender as a principle of stratification. 𝗘𝗍 has introduced the new issue of gender and ethnicity in his work on stratification. Debates have sought to sort out whether inequalities in modern times revolve around class or does gender play a critical role. When we try to understand the inequalities of gender, we find that these inequalities of gender are more deep-rooted historically than class systems. Men have superior standing to women even in societies where there are no classes. In modern societies, class divisions tend to overlap substantially with gender differences. The material position of women tends to reflect that of their fathers or husbands. Hence, some scholars argue that gender equalities can be explained mainly in class terms. Frank Parkin, British sociologist, has expressed this aspect very well. Female status certainly carries with it many inequalities compared with that of males in various areas of social life, including employment opportunities, property ownership, income, and so on. However, these inequalities associated with sex differences are not usefully thought of as components of stratification. This is because for the great majority of women, the allocation of social and economic rewards is determined primarily by the position of their families and in particular that of the male head. Although women today share certain status attributes in common simply by virtue of their sex, their claims over resources are not primarily determined by their occupation, but more commonly by that of their father or husbands. And if wives and daughters of wealthy landowners, there can be no doubt that the differences in their overall situation are far more striking and significant. Gender stratification can be examined at the level of individual outcomes and interactions with a macro perspective that compares indexes of gender inequalities across countries. Although welfare states research examines many aspects within and across societies, it provides important insights in how state policies can shape patterns of gender stratification. A common general understanding of gender stratification refers to the unequal distribution of wealth, power, privilege between the two sexes. It is the level of inequality in society based on gender, the social characteristics associated with sex. Specifically, gender stratification refers to the differential ability of men and women to access society's resources and to receive its privileges. As gender stratification increases, so does the level of gender inequality, reflecting greater differences between men and women access to power. Because historically men have garnered greater social power, gender inequality has systematically disadvantaged women. Gender inequality is complicated, moreover, by the intersection of gender with race, ethnicity, social class, age and sexuality. That is, every individual categorized as either male or female also falls somewhere within a matrix of domination that includes these other dimensions. Gender inequality can be analyzed on the basis of prestige, style of life, privileges, opportunities, association with social groups, income, education, occupation and also power. Feminist scholars such as Joan Acker have criticized traditional stratification research which has mostly ignored gender altogether. The unequal distribution is illustrated by unequal figures regarding employment, participation in politics, education, land ownership, household works and so on. Most wealth is in the hands of men. Most big institutions are run by men. Most science and technology is controlled by men, as mentioned by Connell. Gender inequality in the area of education, economic resources and family are closely linked in individuals' lives, but distinct strands of research have emerged. Although we provide examples of research noting gendered health disparities are outcomes of gender inequalities within societies, not all health research makes this connection. Research on crime as well as migration and citizenship has traditionally focused on men, yet a recent shift to include women more explicitly and gender more broadly has great potential to inform other areas of research on gender stratification. In addition to questions about which dimensions of inequality are important for stratification, the level at which to examine gender stratification is also a key aspect of the scholarly debate. Some scholars compare men and women within couples, others men and women within societies. West and Zimmerman make a compelling argument that gender and by extension gender inequality is created in everyday interactions. Nevertheless, Blau and others point out that understanding contextual factors and their interactions with gender within organizational contexts are essential for a holistic understanding of gender stratification. Gender stratification occurs when gender differences give men greater privilege and power over women, transgender and gender non-conforming people. As gender stratification increases, so does the level of gender inequality, which we have just pointed out, reflecting greater differences between men and women's access to power. Historically, gender inequality has systematically disadvantaged women, with men occupying the positions of dominance in the family and the paid labor force as well as other social institutions, evidenced by women doing the bulk of unpaid housework and being paid less than men in the labor market. Gender inequality is a global phenomenon. Although the relative power of men and women varies across countries and cultures. The disadvantaged position of women relative to men is a predominant factor in global levels of gender stratification, evidenced by women's lower levels of power and control over their reproduction, reduced education and health outcomes, and subjection to violence, intimate and stranger perpetrated at the hands of men. Various theories including structural functionalism, conflict theory and feminist theories have been used as lenses to view gender stratification over a period of time. Gender stratification can also be understood through the lens of feminism, which aims to understand the nature of gender inequality and examines women's social roles, experiences and interests. While generally providing a critique of social relations, much of feminist theory also focuses on analyzing gender inequality and promotion of women's interests. Feminist theory uses the conflict approach to examine the reinforcement of gender roles and inequalities, and conflict theory posits that stratification is dysfunctional and harmful in society, with inequality perpetuated because it benefits the rich and powerful at the expense of the poor. Radical feminism in particular evaluates the role of the patriarchy in perpetuating male dominance. In patriarchal societies, the male's perspective and contributions are considered more valuable, resulting in the silencing and marginalization of women. Feminism focuses on the theory of patriarchy as a system of power that organizes society into complex of relationships based on the assertion of male supremacy. The feminist perspective of gender stratification more recently takes into account intersectionality, a feminist sociological theory first highlighted by feminist sociologist Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality suggests that various biological, social and cultural categories including gender, race, class and ethnicity interact and contribute towards systematic social inequality. Therefore, various forms of oppression such as racism or sexism do not act independently of one another. Instead, these forms of oppression are interrelated, forming a system of oppression that reflects the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination. In the light of this theory, the oppression and marginalization of women is thus shaped not only by gender but by other factors such as race and class. Mary Ann Weathers demonstrates intersectionality in action in An Argument for Black Women's Liberation as a Revolutionary Force. In this publication, Weathers reveals that in the 20th century, working class women of color embodied the notion of intersectionality. The first and second waves of the feminist movement were primarily driven by white women who did not adequately represent the feminist movement as a whole. It was and continues to be important to recognize that white women faced a different form of discrimination than working class women of color, who not only had to deal with sexism but also fought against racism and class oppression. Throughout most of the recorded history and around the globe, women have taken a back seat to men. Generally speaking, men have had and continue to have more physical and social power and status than women, especially in the public arena. Men tend to be more aggressive and violent than women, so they fight wars. Likewise, boys are often required to attain proof of masculinity through strenuous effort. This leads to males holding public office, creating laws and rules, defining society, and some feminists might add controlling women. Male dominance in a society is termed patriarchy. Behind much of the inequalities seen in education, workplace, and politics is sexism or prejudice and discrimination because of gender. Fundamental to sexism is assumption that men are superior to women. Sexism has always had negative consequences for women. It has caused some women to avoid pursuing successful careers typically described as masculine, perhaps to avoid the social impression that they are less desirable as spouses or mothers, or even less feminine. Sexism has also caused women to feel inferior to men or to rate themselves negatively. In short, sexism produces inequality between the genders, particularly in the form of discrimination. In comparable positions in the workplace, for example, women generally receive lower wages than men, but sexism can also encourage inequality in more subtle ways. By making women feel inferior to men, society comes to accept this as the truth. When that happens, women enter the race with lower self-esteem and fewer expectations, often resulting in lower achievements. Sexism has brought gender inequalities to women in almost all arenas of life. Differential socialization leads to gender inequality. Through socialization, it has become a part and parcel of social existence. But inequality has been a special problem in the areas of higher education, work, and politics. Gender stratification is based on 4 forms of power according to Blumberg: political, coercive, economic, and ideological. Economic power, including control of the products or income derived from labor, constitutes a central construct in most macrostructural theories. Along a purely economic dimension, the more economic resources women produce and control, the lower is the level of gender stratification. However, economic power cannot be analyzed alone without the other dimensions like political, coercive, and ideological. The ideology of naturalness of division of labor has been challenged as women started entering the labor force in large numbers. The rise of feminist movement in the West raised questions about division of labor and almost universal subordination of women across societies and cultures. Statistics show that women all over the world earn much less than men for the same work. Occupations are also segregated along gender lines. Feminist scholars have argued that the oppression of women is not to be seen as secondary to class oppression as a whole. Women are oppressed as a class by men, and patriarchal structures are geographically and historically almost universal. Friends, let us now summarize this lesson. The principal forms of stratification apart from caste and class are estate and gender. Estate as form of stratification was present in most parts of Europe, whereas gender as a form of stratification is present from ancient times and continues even in contemporary times. Nobility, clergy, and peasantry are 3 estates, and gender stratification refers to the social ranking where men typically inhabit higher statuses than women. Often the terms gender inequality and gender stratification are used interchangeably.